dearest, who was going to come up next, the nearest relative, came from Scotland, the Stuarts. And the Stuarts lasted just for over 100 years. And maybe I'm biased, but it was one of our worst periods, was the Stuarts. And the first monarch was James I. And he was from 1603 to 1625. There was the gunpowder plot, of course, but the thing that probably he did wrong, he sent Protestants from Scotland and England over to Northern Ireland. And we all know what happened as a result of that. And we'll be mentioning this a little later in my speech. He also considered the divine right of monarchs had to be upheld. And what divinity meant, that the monarch answered to no one but God. I mean, it does seem strange. I mean, even my heroes, the emperors, the famous Roman emperors, believed in that. But I wouldn't have thought 1600 years later they would go along with that. And this was going to befall his son, who in 1625 was, who took over?
Charles I.
Charles the what?
First.
Yes. Now Charles I believed entirely that he knew better than Parliament. And he was at loggerheads with Parliament, and in 1629 he decided there would be no Parliament. And there were no Parliament in 1630, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40. So for 11 years, this country ran without a Parliament. You might say, it could work again. Now he had to recall Parliament, because what he had done 2 years earlier, the Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud, who was very high church, getting near to the, remember we were Protestant, and in fact Charles I married a Catholic French princess, which didn't go down well. And for some reason Charles I decided that in fact they would put into Scotland the new prayer book, which was high Anglican, all the trappings that you would normally not expect in the normal church. Now, what are the Scots? What is their religion?
Catholic.
Presbyterian. And they are staunch. Now, can you imagine Charles I and his army going up to Scotland and getting them to accept the English Anglican Bible? No way. Of course, he lost the war. He needed more money. The only way to get money, he had to get Parliament to resit. Parliament said he will only resit if you agree to democracy. It went on for a year, and then it was quite obvious that they couldn't agree. And the start of the Civil War was in August 1642. And what really started that off, in January of that year, Charles I, with 100 army, marched into Parliament to try and arrest 5 of the members who he considered were acting against his interest. And the result of that, by the way, what does Parliament do every year? Black Rod. And what's the purpose of Black Rod?
That is coming in.
Yes. In other words, the monarch cannot enter Parliament without approval. And that has occurred every year since 1642. So the war starts. Now, the names they call themselves, the parliamentarians call themselves Roundheads. Any idea why they were called Roundheads, Terry? Any idea why they were called Roundheads?
They're all
Well, they had a bull over their head and they shaved round it, so they all had haircuts like that. And the royalists were the Cavaliers. Now, it was quite obvious that the parliamentarians were going to have trouble. And incidentally, this war, as a percentage, more men lost their lives in the Civil War than lost it in the First World War. So it shows you just how much that affected this country. And Edge Hill was the first battle in 1642, and it was a victory for the Royalists. The following year, and the North, especially Yorkshire, was very much Royalist. And at Walton Moor, which is near Bradford, they scored another victory. There were a lot of other battles, but these were the main big ones. The year after was Marston Moor, again in Yorkshire. And in fact there... Pardon?
There you go.
Near York.
No,
Yeah. It was then a victory. They were now getting organised. What they were doing under Oliver Cromwell, one of my heroes, because in those days, you know, you had to pay for your own army, but the parliamentarians realised that in 1644 that we had to have professional army. They called themselves the New Model Army. And as a result, in fact, they were then successful. And in the final battle at Naseby, which is in Northampton, they won. So we now got to 1646, and the parliamentarians have won. He's captured, he's Charles I. They take him to Hampton Court, and they try their best to, in fact, get him to accept democracy and religious freedom. But he only believed that he was right and Parliament was wrong. Blimey, must have been hard work, like some of our Rotarians. So, although he was held at Hampton Court, he wasn't really under lock and key. And what he did, he escaped, we call escaped, and went to the Isle of Wight, where he had friends in one of the castles there. The Second Civil War is now going to start, because what Charles I then does, while he's at the Isle of Wight, thinks, right, what do I need to do now to make these parliamentarians? So he came up with a cunning plan. And the plan was, although a few years earlier he had tried to get the English Bible into Scotland, he then contacts his friends up in Scotland and said, you support me and we'll put Presbyterianism into England for 3 years. In other words, they turned full cycle. So the Second Civil War starts. Oliver Cromwell now is the #1. He had taken over from Thomas Fairfax and decided one civil war was enough. He wasn't going to every other one. So the Scots are coming down to Preston, and Oliver Cromwell, who is in Yorkshire, hears about it and comes along to meet them. And on the 18th of August 1648, he sleeps at Stonyhurst. Well, it wasn't a college then, it was Stonyhurst House. And if you ever go through Stonyhurst, on a plinth there's a table and there's a little reading telling you that Oliver Cromwell slept on this table in full armour on the 18th of August 1648. Following day, near where my son has his business at Wimbledon, the battle takes place. It only lasted 2 days. Heavily defeated with the Scots. So he's captured again. So this time he's more or less put under lock and key, is Charles I. He's taken down to Windsor Castle and held there, and he still will not accept the two principles of religious tolerance and democracy. So finally he had to be put on trial. On the 4th of January 1649 he's put on trial, still insists that he answers only to God. So eventually 59 had to sign his death warrant. And by Jove, if you were one of those 59, in 10 years' time, if you weren't scarpered, you were going to meet a very violent death. And he was sent to the block. What was the date that Charles I lost his head, please?
30th of January.
Very glad you would get in, Maureen. I should have said you can't answer it. He was a brave man, give him his due, stupid man, absolutely stupid. No, not to accept democracy and religious tolerance. How could he do that? But on the day, the January cold day, public appearance he asked for another shirt because it was cold. He said, I don't want the people to see that I'm not brave. So he's gone. So we've now got a country without monarchy. So they decided we're going to be called the Commonwealth. Good name, wasn't it? And Oliver Cromwell will be the chairman. But the Third Civil War was about to start now. His son, which was in Charles II, gets royalists from Ireland and from Scotland, and there's further wars, of which Oliver Cromwell in 1649 has to go into Ireland. He was savage, was Oliver Cromwell. He was a Puritan, was Oliver Cromwell, who thought that God told him what he had to do. And because they had attacked the Protestants a few years earlier, he decimated wherever he went. And his name goes down very badly, especially in Drogheda, however you pronounce it, in Wexford. The following year he had to go to Scotland, at Dunbar, and beats the Scots, and the following year, in 1651, he beats the English royalists down in Worcester. So now it's finished, but we're still going to run the country. They decided then that they were going to make Oliver Cromwell Lord Protector, which was okay, but the Rug Parliament, the parliamentarians who were there at the time before the war, they wanted things that Oliver Cromwell thought was unreasonable, and he had to dismiss Parliament twice, and the third Parliament was made up of army officers. In other words, we were really a country under martial law. Well, maybe that was okay. He was offered the kingship twice, was Oliver Cromwell, and twice he rejected it. And in 1658, he dies. And Richard, his son, who they call Tumble Down Dick, he then takes over. But he was like his dad. And it was then decided we better go back to monarchy. And in 1660, Charles II takes over. And Charles II knew what the country wanted: democracy and religious freedom. And he gave it them. He was the Merry King. He had mistresses left, right and centre. Who was his favourite mistress?
Delboy?
Well, no Maury, I think not Maury, not in Scotland. Delboy. And he did very well. He had two disasters before 1660. Any idea what the disasters were, Stuart?
Just look, Michael.
Tell them. The Great Plague and the Fire of London in 2 successive years. So in 1660 he dies. And his son James II takes over. James II tried to introduce back the very thing that Charles I was guilty of. He decided we had to be a Catholic. He married a Catholic lady. The country wouldn't have anything of it. So who do we bring in to save the Protestant cause in England? Who do we bring in? William of Orange. And he arrives at Brixham in 1688 in November. Has anyone been to Brixham?
Yep.
Yeah.
Big statue of him, William of Orange. Of course, what we then have is a situation where the Battle of the Boyne, which was 1690, you thought it might be 1689. So you've lost your bet at the fiver today on the bowling. Has he lost his bet on the bowling? Has he lost his bet?
Looks like it.
Yes. So 1690. So we're back. William and Mary is now in the country, and the last monarch of the Scots was who? Who was the last monarch?
James.
Before the Germans take over. I mean, there we are. The Tudors were Welsh, the Stuarts were Scottish, and the following mob from Germany. I mean, we're not very good, are we, at the English, are we, at running our own country? The last monarch was Queen Anne. And Queen Anne had 17 pregnancies, and not one lived beyond the age of 11. Now, of course, the country at this stage, they did not want the Catholic faith to come back. Sorry, Stuart. I mean, I'm easy peasy about it. I'm easy whether it's Protestant or Catholic. But they passed a law. Now, Maureen, you can't tell me. No. What was the law they passed in 1701?
No Catholic can be
Yes. No Catholic can be king, and the king cannot marry, or the queen cannot marry a Catholic. And of course that's remained ever since. So that was a tremendous period, wasn't it not, in our history. The George I, George II, George III, they take over afterwards. The first one, George I, he couldn't speak English. And he brought two mistresses over with him. He kept his wife locked up in Hanover. And one was called the Beanpole and one was called the Elephant. Is that right? But through the Georgian period, our country went up and up and up. Thank you very much.
Well, what can you say? What a master. I mean, last week I had a privilege, I think it was. I've never been to Osborne House before, but I went to Osborne House and studied as best I could a sort of map, which would have highly delighted you, Michael, which was made back in Victorian times, right up to the reign and all the predecessors of Queen Victoria. And then all the families listed underneath. And the crossbreeding and inbreeding is unbelievable. How anybody can follow this and study it and be able to let it just flow out like Michael does is absolutely amazing. Now, I thought, and perhaps I don't know whether I won't accuse Maureen of Googling, but I Googled yesterday just in case. And I thought, he's bound to say something to me. Now, Ian, you're from York, and you know what he's like. Being from York, you know all about Marston Moor. And I thought, I better know something about it. So I quickly Googled and found that the Royalists lost 1,500 men that day. And Cromwell's, because he was a Cavalier, of course, cavalryman, I beg your pardon, the parliamentarians lost 500 on that day. In 1644. Dates are stuck in my mind last night as I went to sleep. He's bound to us for that. Thank goodness he didn't, because I would have forgotten. But thank you, Michael. I think everyone's enlightened in some way. It's certainly very interesting, and the date 1701 is interesting. I didn't know that, about sort of banning Roman Catholics from high office in that way. Can we show our appreciation to our good